Like we were talking about how, the words that they used back then are different than the words we have now. There's words now that didn't even exist back then, especially even in that language. There's science. There's so many science didn't exist until a certain period of time with the positivism movement, and then it moved to a less strict post-positivism movement, where it went more into subjective, qualitative research. But all these scientific terms that we've come to create, like you're saying, they've only just existed within the past few, thousands of years that we've lived. And so, of course, the language of the Bible isn't going to include scientific terminology. You couldn't expect it to, because those words did not exist.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Out of the Box podcast, where Steele and I, your hosts, get to talk about outside of the box ideas. Today, we actually have a really interesting topic. We're going to be talking about Steele.
We're going to be talking about how God created the world and human.
Yeah,
We're going to talk about Genesis, basically.
the story of creation. So before we get started on this topic, I do want to invite you guys to give us a like down below. Also, subscribe to our channel. And also, if you have any interesting thoughts throughout this conversation, please feel free to drop them down below. We will love to hear from you. So without further ado, Steele, let us know. So what intrigues you about the creation story? Is there something that you kind of discovered, or how does that relate with science? Give us an idea.
Yeah, I mean, as a Catholic, learning it as a child, it's like, oh, yeah, that's interesting, and that makes sense. And then you get older, and you learn about evolution in school, and at the time, I believed in both worlds. I believed in evolution just as much as I believed in my Catholic beliefs, and some of that still holds a bit true to this day, in some sense. However, I mean, and I was when I went to college, I was a biology major, so I got deeper into all of that stuff. There was even one point where I went to my biology professor and kind of debated, evolution a little bit to try to understand it. It was more of a learning exercise. People might think of it as, oh, you're just trying to prove you right, or do this or that. But I always think about it as a learning experience, because I'm not doing it with the intention of trying to maliciously I'm just trying to like figure it out, honestly. And I try to be as honest as I can in my approach and in terms of studying. And I'm trying to study evolution right now on my own more deeply than I've ever had before. Of course, it's really hard to balance when you have like jobs and studying and other things you have to do, but trying to work it in there. But bottom line is, you know, as a Catholic, of course, I believe that God somehow, in some way, created everything, the universe that we see here, the multiverse, however many universes there are. And so what I'm building up to here is in college, that was when I really studied deeper the Bible and Genesis, and trying to really pick it apart, trying to decode it, trying not decode, but like trying to understand it in a deep way than I ever had before. And I started going through this process of trying to interpret the language of the Bible in modern scientific terminology and trying to understand it in a different way. Trying to take modern scientific concepts that I learned in my biology and chemistry classes and trying to see where that could possibly fit in the first few paragraphs of Genesis, the creation of the world. Because, the beautiful thing about the Bible, and to many people's detriment, it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And people are debating that for centuries. But based on everything I just said, I don't know. What do you think, Jose, about all this?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. And, I think to some degree, maybe the Bible itself is more scientific than we think that it is, right? Albert Einstein, kind of mentioned, the more I learn about science, the more I believe in a possibility of a God existing, or omni, like some sort of power outside of us existing, which is really crazy. And so that makes me think, we've had these conversations before, and how maybe the creation story in itself is just a representation of what people could understand at that time, what creation was, right? So, supposedly, the Bible has had um, revelations of, different things that are happening today, right? Or in our history. Some people have said that there's mentions of, big birds flying in the sky, which could maybe be translated to airplanes, but back then they just didn't know the concept of an airplane, or didn't
That's
know various scientific concepts that now, and they, after research, we kind of put a term to it. But people back then, they could only explain it in the way that they could with what they knew,
yeah,
right?
this reminds we have had this question before at St. Mary's, like we were talking about how, the words that they used back then are different than the words we have now. There's words now that didn't even exist back then, especially even in that language. There's so many science didn't exist until a certain period of time with the positivism movement, and then it moved to a less strict post-positivism movement where it went more into subjective, qualitative experimental research. But all these scientific terms that we've come to create, like you're saying, they've only just existed within the past few, thousands of years that we've lived. And so of course the language of the Bible isn't going to include scientific terminology. You couldn't expect it to, because those words did not exist back
Yeah.
then, you know
Yeah, and if you start thinking about it, the Bible kind of mentions that, God created Adam from the soil, from the sand,
right? And
you
then I
know?
was telling you, like,
But
what
what
is the
if you think
soil
about it, like,
besides
I
that?
know, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
What is the
the sand could just be a representation of the smallest particle that people could perceive with their eyes.
which is the
But maybe what they were really trying to say is that God made us from the same substance as the earth, which is particles,
which everything
molecules,
around us
atoms.
is made of what you're saying, atoms, and then particles make up atoms, and so
Yeah.
it
If you
comes.
think about it, also, soil, like dirt itself, gives life to plants, which in turn gives life to animals,
Yeah, that
right?
transfer of
And
energy.
so it's almost like, soil back then was the provider of life, right?
Yeah,
And
that's why the sun god is.
everything's kind of created from it. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting,
It
um
makes you think, but then, it makes you
that
think.
they use that.
I think what you're saying makes me think about, like, where do we get this information from? We get it from the Bible. Where's the information from the Bible? And of course, as me and you as Catholics, we believe it comes from God. But, like, deeper than that, where does it come from? So if we believe that the information comes from a deity, from God, from this being, so, like, as far as I understand it, the Bibles started out with word of mouth, and then it evolved into written language, and now it's become translated into the Bible we have today. But, like,
Yeah.
so did these people were these was this information revealed through was it revealed through visions? Was it revealed through dreams? Adam and Eve, well, then we could even think, like, Adam and Eve w- lived, right, and they spoke a language because God created in that way, as it says in the Bible, and they spoke words. And so the story of Adam and Eve would be carried on by their children that they had, and then their children's children would carry on that story, and that would be that word of mouth that keep continuing amongst the generations of generations until it finally gets written down. So I mean, if that's the case, then Adam and Eve's children and Adam and Eve themselves were the eyewitness testament, I first, eyewitnesses of God creating the earth and them. And so, it's so I could see how someone would come in there and say during this word of mouth, or you just say it was all made up, or say, oh, it just got exaggerated along the way by the first beings that existed on Earth. But I don't know; it's so complicated.
Yeah, because the creation story, it talks about the world being created in 7 days, right? But what does 7 days mean in God's time? To
Yeah,
mean
that's up to debate.
700 years, 7 million years, 7 billion years? I don't know. I would have to look at, how old
How it's
our
translated,
Earth is,
right?
or our universe, but it's definitely a couple of billion years.
Well, the thing,
Um,
the estimation of billions of years, it's based on I'm trying not to get too deep into it because I'm limited knowledge on the subject, but from what I've read so far, it's based on certain assumptions, and if those assumptions are not true, then we don't really know
Yeah,
100% if it's the universe is 4 point whatever billion years old
yeah,
because there's assumptions.
yeah, and like,
Yeah,
and it's just interesting too, like, how the creation story goes into maybe not complete detail, but how first there was the earth, and the shallowness of the earth. And then, even the fact that, you know, the Bible says God spoke the words and they came to
yeah.
existence,
That's what I find
right? It's
most
almost like
fascinating.
it's something that wasn't in motion and it starts in motion. And so what scientists found is that our earth is actually increasing like a wave. It's expanding like a wave, they come to find, like, that it's actually moving outwards, which is interesting because when you speak a word, it's almost like when you drop something in water and it creates those waves
Right, the
and it
chain
keeps
reaction, yeah,
expanding, and so which
vibration.
means that if something, like the Big Bang might have been words coming out of God's mouth into existence, and so everything started,
And a priest came up with a Big
and
Bang.
that was a Big Bang,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that there you can see the combination of
that
science
you're
and
jogging my
theology.
you're jogging my memory with that because I remember we talked about this too, right? You probably remember this.
Yeah,
We talked about how maybe God, because words, sound, wavelengths of sound themselves are vibrations, And we were talking about how maybe God's voice, a specific vibration of the universe was enough. Like if you want to get dive into string theory, I think that's what we're talking about. Like string theory says there's these tiny vibrating strings that make up the atoms that make up everything. So
yeah,
like what if certain vibrations vibrate those strings in a certain way to produce certain particles, which produce certain atoms, which produce certain forms and things we see around us? And what if God's voice is that vibration that vibrates those strings, the theoretical
yeah,
strings of string theory that, then create the different types of particles, which create the different types of atoms? Because vibrations do affect reality. We couldn't hear each other
yeah,
without vibrations.
which is
How sound
interesting.
works, you know?
Because it's almost, we see the change of vibration when we freeze water,
Yeah, you do
right?
tell me
Because
something
when
like that.
water is flowing, it's out there. But when we freeze water, like the molecules vibrate, but so much smaller because now they're in a solid aspect. So if somebody can organize vibration, and use it to their advantage, then they can create things, like maybe even I'm wondering if maybe if you change the vibration of something, it can become, turn water into wine, you
Right,
know?
well, 'cause if that would just be a matter of changing the number of, what was it, protons and electrons or something like that, because the periodic table of elements is just
Mm,
literally the difference between 2 atoms could be 1 or less electrons and protons and such like that make up the atom. Like, that's you change 1 and it completely changes the element. It's mind-blowing. But that reminds me of something you told me about when we were having this discussion back then, something about, like, how vibrations affect patterns that were found, like, I don't know if it was, like, water or, like, emotions, like, negative emotions can produce certain
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's really interesting because, like, water can really absorb, and they've come to, there's actual scientists that have studied water, that it can actually, receive almost like emotions in a way. So what they did is that they put, regular water bottle, some water inside of it, and they filled another water bottle with the same water, right? With the same faucet and everything. And so for one of them, they started telling the water bottle like negative words. They started saying you're stupid, you're ugly, you're like just sending bad energy to it. If that can kind of sound woo woo to some people. And to the other one, they started saying like beautiful things, amazing things, like just you're amazing, you're beautiful, this and that. And then they went to look at in a microscope the molecules of the water. So the molecules in the water that, had negative energy and bad words thrown at it, it was just regular disorganized, just water itself. But the other water that, had positive emotions, good words, actually had some geographic figures, like almost as crystals, right? It formed geometric features, which is interesting because how that could change. So, like, just from
Yeah.
exerting emotion, exerting words, had such a big impact on how the molecules had formed,
Yeah, and the reason why,
right?
because it goes right back to God's word, like words, like what you're saying, words, vibrations, maybe the positive or negative, that tone, the vocal tone in the positive and
Yeah,
negatives, maybe the different vibrations of positive and negative. If God's voice is a vibration, well, the thing is, it's debatable because is that just a metaphor, God speaking and then this happening? I'm sure theologians have debated that for a long time too, but it's like, what do we really mean? Do we mean he's literally saying, or is he using vibrations, or is it just to break down the complexity of what's really happening, what God's really doing? Because our human minds are incapable of even comprehending what creation would even look like or be like. That's another question.
yeah, yeah.
But
We're
then
just kind of
fascinating.
scratching the tip of it
Scratching
right
the tip
here,
of
right?
the
Like
iceberg. Genesis 1,
even
John 1 1 talks about, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It says the Word
word,
was God.
word. Drop the mic right there.
And John 1:14, I believe, it's like, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So like the Word was made into Adam, made into flesh. So like
Made into flesh.
about the
Yeah. So yeah, it talks about like words being coming into existence. If we think about our life, like, I was having, a little bit about self-reflection. Sometimes words can help us create or understand what we're going through, what we want to achieve, right? It's how we pass knowledge from one generation to another through words, through communication, which is something very powerful as communication majors. I just find this correlation with it. But, if we kind of go back into the words that God spoke, in the Bible kind of talks about Genesis 1 27, it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So if we go to that word, and I don't want this to sound like we're preaching or anything, but if we go right there, God created us in his image. And I used to think, man, I used to think that we looked like God, like
Yeah, no, right. Yeah,
he had
that's what.
like
Yeah.
faith and like, you know, I used to think like, man, he looks like a human, and maybe Jesus is the human representation. But I'm starting to think now, and I had this realization the other day that maybe God created us in his likeness and his image, but we have a body just like Jesus Christ. We have a spirit. The Holy Spirit is the representation. And then we have a mind, right? The Father, right? Who leads and guides usually in a family. And so if we break that down, we resemble the divine God, right? Body, spirit, and mind, right? We represent the Father, the Son, and the Spirit as well, right? It's we are a representation of that. And so I can't remember what philosopher said, but he said that if you want to find the answers of the universe, look within yourself, right? And so it's very interesting how maybe we do have the blueprint, right, of creation, of how creation was created.
Yeah,
um
yeah, that's true.
but we just have to look at ourselves, or maybe look at the surrounding, you know
Makes you think. I mean, I guess my final
I think it
thoughts.
might have been Plato.
It might have. Yeah, I'm not sure actually, but like,
Yeah, because I think there was a picture of Socrates looking up and then Plato looking down. Socrates thought you had to look up into the heavens to actually find the answers of the world, and Plato looked down at the earth because it was like, no, through nature and through ourselves you can find the answers.
That's actually
So
that's pretty interesting. I actually didn't know that. That two
yeah,
different.
there's like a painting or an image or something.
I'm about to check that out. Well, I guess what I'll leave it with is something I wrote down when I was trying to interpret all this. Just the first verse of Genesis and John 1:1 and Genesis 1:1, and I'll get your I guess opinion on it. So I was basically coming down to breaking it down to scientific terms. So I came up with something like this: the resonance of the Earth, the frequency is able to make molecules and atoms come together to form DNA and other structures. Is God's voice or word that same frequency, the resonance of God's voice? What's your impression of that?
Man, sounds very scientific to me.
That's the
But yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense. Like that, if you think about it, we when we read it, it seems almost as you know, kind of like a child's story, right? But then when we look at it more in scientific terms, like you just read it, it just makes more sense. Like, oh, like maybe there is a correlation between science and like what scientists have said creation or the Big Bang would look like or something, and the Bible. But sometimes there's not that many people that just go into it and make that connection there,
right.
you know? So,
One of
and
the other.
it's still a mystery to scientists how creation was. It's just theories out there, that are formulated to see how the world actually came to existence. But it does make sense how a lot of things that they're saying correlate with the story of the Bible.
Yeah, it's fast.
Yeah. So if you got to the end of this video, we really appreciate you staying in tune with us. Also, if you do find something interesting, please let us know what was it that caught your attention about the creation story. Also, please leave a like if you like this video and subscribe to our channel because Steele and I are committed to providing and continue providing amazing outside of the box content for you. So until next time, we will see you soon.